How's it going, guys? This is our third week in our Samson series. Tonight we're going to be looking in Judges 16. So we've spent the last 2 weeks in the story of Samson. And now the first week we looked at the Nazirite vow of Samson and how he let sin get way too close to his life. And that vow is actually going to come back into our story tonight, which is going to be pretty cool. Last week we looked at his revenge on the Philistines for killing his first wife and her father. And we realized together that revenge is a dangerous thing, and it'll usually end up burning pretty much everyone involved and not fixing anything. So at the end of our reading last week, we found that Samson had gone on to be a judge for Israel for like another 20 years, right? And we're going to pick up our reading this week in chapter 16 at the end of that 20 years. It starts in verse 4, and it says, "After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, 'Seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we'll give you each 1,100 pieces of silver.' So Delilah said to Samson, 'Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you.'" Samson hadn't changed much in 20 years, obviously, right? He still had a weakness in his love for women. And actually, chapter 16 starts off with a really weird and random hookup. And then we jump forward into verse 4 that we just read, and we're introduced to his newest fling named Delilah, a name that we're all familiar with. And now, the Philistine leaders approached Delilah about betraying Samson. Now, keep in mind, this was 20 years after some of the earlier beef between Samson and the Philistines. They were holding this crazy grudge here, and it was so important for them to get back at Samson. They offered Delilah a pretty large sum of money to tell them the secret of his strength. Now, we don't know exactly how many people approached her about the request, but the pronoun that they use in scripture is plural, so we know that the lords of the Philistines was more than just one Philistine leader, and each one offered to pay her 1,100 pieces of silver to turn over Samson. The bottom line, it was a big payout for Delilah if she was willing to betray Samson. Now, you would hope that she would take some time and really think through all of this and the consequences, and then would come clean to Samson about the offer and tell them what they had tried to do, but sadly it's not the case. The very next verse has Delilah asking Samson to tell her the secret of his strength and how someone might bind him. So much for being subtle there, Delilah, right? Good grief. Samson messes with her a few times in scripture, and he gives her 3 bogus ways to bind him up. The first time he says to use 7 bowstrings, and then he says 7 brand new ropes, and then he says braid his hair into 7 braids and weave them into loom. And man, all of these were lies. And each time Delilah would do exactly as Samson said, and then call on the Philistines who were waiting in her room to ambush him. Each time, scripture tells us Samson would easily break out of the snare, and the Philistines, man, they were getting fed up. So Delilah was getting more and more desperate and frustrated each time, saying how if Samson really loved her, he wouldn't keep telling her these lies. So let's jump forward to Judges 16, verse 15, and see how she handles things after that third lie that he tells her. "And she said to him, 'How can you say I love you when your heart's not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies.' And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, 'A razor has never come upon my head. For I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be just like any other man.'" Finally, after enough begging and pleading, Delilah broke Samson down, and he told her his secret, that his strength came from God because of a vow that was made for him before he was even born. Now, of course, we know about this vow since we studied it the first week, right? And we have seen Samson actually skirt the edges of that vow in some pretty dumb decisions in his life. But God still upheld his part of the promise, even though Samson had been unfaithful. And that's a preachable moment right there, but we're going to keep going in the story for now. So the Philistines know the secret to Samson's superhuman strength. And over 20 years of their anger and their frustration, man, it's boiling over. And they finally have a way to get their revenge on Samson. Now, don't forget what we talked about last week, right? That revenge has a way of ultimately burning everyone and not just the person it's aimed at. So let's keep reading in Judges 16:18 and see what it has to say. It says, "When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, 'Come up again, for he has told me all of his heart.' And then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She made him, Samson, sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks on Samson's head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And he awoke from his sleep and said, "Well, I will go out as the other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, Delilah was ready to get paid, right? And she had been toyed with enough by Samson. So she went right back to the Philistine leaders and told them that she finally had the answer that they were looking for. So they brought the silver that she was promised, and she betrayed Samson. She had his head shaved by another guy, and after his head was shaved, his Nazirite vow was void. It was broken. He had broken the contract, and God allowed that supernatural strength that he had given Samson to slip away. So Samson was just like everyone else now, except for his massive ego. Now when he woke up and got ready to bust free just like normal, only to find the strength that he had known for so many years was gone, man, could you imagine what that must have felt like for Samson? Now, Samson wasn't known for his great diplomacy. He wasn't a wise man like Solomon in Scripture. Samson's only claim to fame was his strength, and he had just woke up as weak as everybody else around him. Scripture tells us that as they took Samson away, they gouged out his eyes. It wasn't enough just to kill Samson and be done with him, right? The Philistines wanted to torture him. They wanted to embarrass him and belittle him and to make him suffer all the wrongs that he had done to them over the years. And if you caught that last part of the section, man, we read tonight, it's like it reminds me of like the Marvel movies, right? They have the teaser at the end of the credits, and it's about something new that's coming up. I can see them almost leading a broken Samson away, right? He's blind, he's beaten, chained up, and then the camera zooms in on his hastily shaven head, and as the camera focuses in, we see this little bit of fuzz kind of start growing on his scalp, right? It's like a Marvel thing. It's a sign of things to come. And we'll see what becomes of that stubble next week as we close out the story of Samson. You don't want to miss it, guys, I promise. It's pretty epic. Even by Marvel standards, it's pretty epic. Now, before we sign off for tonight, I wanted to look at some application from this season of Samson's life. Man, it was pretty shocking how quickly and how easily Delilah turned on Samson. What was also shocking for me as I read is how careless Samson was with this amazing gift that he had been given from God. He had taken a Nazirite vow, which required things of him, right? Sacrifices he had to make. But in return, God had given him a superhuman strength, and he had done some crazy, amazing things with that strength. But then just to joke about the source of his strength to Delilah and make up all these lies, and then to ultimately give away his real secret to this woman who clearly had ulterior motives, it's foolish, it's crazy. On this side of history, man, we're just dumbfounded by how naive Samson was in the part that we read today. Dude, she is asking for the secret to your strength and how to bind you up. Like, Samson, do you think there could be something else going on behind the scenes, some scheming here? Samson was so overconfident that he didn't pick up on it. Instead, he told Delilah the secret was in his hair, and once it was shaved, that vow that Samson had kept from the womb, it had been broken, and his strength was gone. Let me ask you guys a question, and I really do want you to think hard before you answer. Have you ever made a vow with God that required something of you? What about if you were praying for the health of a loved one and you promised to take your faith more seriously? Like, if this person gets better, I'll be in church more. Or what about you begging God to help out a bad situation that you found yourself in and then promising to him that, you know what, God, I'm never going to do this again if you can just get me out of this one. Those are all vows. And we have all made promises like those at some point in our lives. It might not even be that deep, right? It could have been praying for God to help us out in passing a test, and then we promised to study more the next time. A lot of you guys can feel that, right? Now, of those promises that you just thought about, how many of them have you kept without fail, like pristine? I'm sure some of you guys can think of ones that you're still holding up your end of the bargain, but I'm also confident there are some where you have long since dropped the ball. Now, we're all in agreement with that, right? Now, here's the really cool part. Samson had failed, right? He had broken his vow on his own arrogance, and his strength left. But God wasn't through with him. It was going to take more than one failure in Samson's life to redirect God's plan. Now, as we closed out, we saw the stubble start growing on his head again, and his captors, they couldn't see it. Maybe Samson could feel it as he ran his head over his scalp for the first time in his life. But Scripture tells us in detail that his hair was growing back. And guys, when we make a promise to God and we break it, if we're honest, we often feel worthless. But we feel like we don't deserve God's love or his attention. Oftentimes, when that happens, people are going to turn away from their faith or turn away from God out of shame. But God doesn't handle it that way. When we look through Scripture, not just in the story of Samson, man, through the bigger story of the Bible, we see people failing God time and time again, only to have God pick them up, dust them off, and put them back on the right track. We don't have to be defeated by our failure. Instead, we need to reach out to God's already extended hand and accept the grace and the forgiveness that he's going to offer us. There might be an area of your life tonight where you feel like you have absolutely failed God, and there is no way that he is going to get past that failure. But let me assure you, God can handle and overcome any failure in our lives. He wants us to return to him with a humble heart, and guys, he's going to restore us. Your failure isn't the end of God's story in your life. It's just a season of growth, and God is going to do some amazing things through it when you don't give up. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this week in the study of Samson. I hope you guys have learned from it. Can't wait to share with you guys what God does next week and as we close out his story. And I just hope you guys are all doing well and look forward to seeing you soon.